All right. So we are up and running. It looks like the computer is working. Hopefully the microphone is improved from yesterday. There was a bit of a technical glitch.
Okay.
As I mentioned last week, tonight is going to be a Q&A, a question and answer. And we'll do another one of these later on. And as I mentioned before we started, but for those that are watching, we're going to finish about 10 minutes early because I need to head to one of our family's homes that has Shiva. Shiva is the period of mourning right after the burial. And we'll cover mourning and all of those details. But we do the services in their home because they stay at home during that period. So, but that means I've got to face Orlando traffic.
Wow.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start with some of the questions that were emailed in for people who couldn't make it in person but still wanted to participate. And the first question that comes up is hell. That is to say, what does Judaism believe about hell? So first, right off the bat, I don't like the word. It's not that I mind the word. It's not a swear word or anything like that, but that word has been captured both by other religions as well as by movies and TV shows and all of that. And so as soon as you say hell, people immediately have an idea of what they think that means. And then I have to fight to bring it back. So the better word, or at least what I prefer to ask, is punishment after death.
Okay.
Right. That's the real question, right? Judaism understands that there can be punishment in this life. Very important. Not everything that happens to us is punishment, right? You break your toe, that doesn't mean God is punishing you, but it could. And only you can decide, right? You're not allowed to tell someone else. Jewish law is very clear on this. You're not allowed to tell someone else God's punishing you. That is forbidden under Jewish law because it is deeply insulting, offensive, and not true. This is partly what the whole book of Job is about. The majority of the book of Job is Job's friends telling him, you must be guilty because otherwise why are you suffering? And Job, throughout the entire book, says, but I'm not guilty. So why am I suffering? And when God shows up, God tells the friends who were defending God's justice, get out of here. You're worthless, right? You people who were telling Job that he was a bad person because bad things happened to him, get out of here, right? So in this life, yes, there can be punishment, but not everything bad that happens is punishment, and only the person to whom it's happening can actually make that decision. So, but the question we actually have for tonight, however, is once you're dead. So Judaism believes very much that as we live in this life, we are drawn towards God and we are drawn away from God. Now, a lot of people tend to think of this as being like a bank book, like your checking account, right? You put money in, you're getting better and better and better, and then you do bad things, and so you're spending it, and it goes down and down and down. And the idea being you want to be above zero when you cash out. That's not really the Jewish idea. Instead, the Jewish idea is that there is your good, oh, not God, but good, and there is your bad, and they're separate accounts, right? You've got your good account and you've got your bad account. You do something good, that's great. You could be rewarded in this world. Don't expect it, however, and instead you could be rewarded in the world to come. That is to say, after death. That's generally what we talk about when we mean heaven. We'll cover that a little bit more later. The bad account, on the other hand, doing good doesn't immediately transfer and cancel out the bad. And doing bad doesn't cancel out the good. They each are their own account. Separately, which means you could be a super great person who's done so many wonderful things, kept all the commandments, lived a righteous and pious life, but there was that one time when you went to the 7-Eleven and you stole a stick of gum, right? And you never said you were sorry for it. You never returned or paid the penalty for it. And you just always were kind of happy you got away with stealing that gum. Everything else you did in your life was wonderful and righteous, but you've got, one little line of bad and all good otherwise, right? Now you might think, well, all that good is good and that bad is so small, so who cares about that? Judaism says no. If there is a transgression that has gone unrepented, you never said you were sorry, never even felt you were sorry, and unrepaired, you never fixed the damage that you did, then when you die, that will be fixed. Right? And that's what we talk about when we mean punishment after death. Now, how big of a fix, how traumatic of a fix? Well, if it's stealing a pack of gum, we're not talking about a big fix here, right? So this is not you are in fire forever, right? In fact, Judaism doesn't really believe in a literal physical location or bodily punishment. And shocker, Judaism also doesn't believe in a literal physical bodily reward. When you go to heaven, you're not going to be sitting in a hammock, right? Because you're not going to have a body and there won't be hammocks. Your body will experience, your spirit will experience what would be considered contentment, pleasure, and joy, but your body doesn't, right? The joy we feel in heaven is not going to come through our nerve endings, and the suffering we have as we are punished doesn't come through our nerves either. It's more akin to your soul feeling the regret it should have felt while you were still alive, and then feeling the damage that it did by how it behaved. So the smaller the deed, the smaller the regret, the smaller the damage that you did, therefore the smaller the amount of suffering. The bigger the deed, you murdered 5,000 people, your soul is going to, once it has passed from this world and once it is moved beyond all of the delusions and lies that it told itself of why it was okay to murder 5,000 people, when it gets to the other side, it's going to go, oh man. But not just, oh, I stole a pack of gum, but I can't believe I took all of those lives. I did all that was so horrible. What was I thinking? Your soul will recognize the darkness that it did when it stands in the light of the next world. And that adjustment is going to be uncomfortable. That adjustment is what we call punishment. And the more severe the damage the soul did, the more it's going to feel the suffering of what it realizes as it moves into the next world. No fire, no pitchforks, but definite balancing of justice, right? That little debt has to be taken care of, and big debts have to be taken care of as well. And Judaism also believes that the good will be taken care of too. But funny enough, a lot of people don't ask about this one. Most people ask about what happens for the bad stuff. For the bad stuff. Which is fair, because most of us have a hard time imagining what true joy would be, but most of us have a pretty good idea of what physical suffering is like. And that means we tend to focus on that. But again, we're not talking about a physical torment. Even when you see people talk about physical things in the afterlife, it's being used as a metaphor. That's being used as poetry to try and help us, because we're bodies, feel what it might be like, even though because we're bodies, we can't really understand it yet. But we will when we get there. So, does the concept of punishment after death exist? Yes. Is it anything like what you see in movies? Is it anything like on TV? Is it anything like the great paintings of the Renaissance artists and all of that? No. Still, great paintings. I love Renaissance art. But as far as theology goes, it's not ours. We don't go in for that sort of thing.
No.
Yeah.
The punishment after death, that would be like Gehinnom?
So Gehinnom is a term used for this period of transition. And that's the classic Aramaic term that's used for it. Okay. You also will hear the phrase used of Sheol, which literally means sort of the pit, the underworld. But pit, again, in English sounds, oh, the pit, right? It's all nasty and everything. No, it's more like the waiting room. Okay. In between this life and the next. Okay. That's you got to sit in the bus station for a while. Again, there's not actually time. It's more metaphysical than that.
Okay.
Good?
Yeah.
All right. Next question that we had sent in. How are angels considered in practical everyday terms? Does Judaism believe in guardian angels for each person, etc.? All right, so first of all, before we can get to practical terms, we got to figure out what are angels in the first place. Okay, so there is God, and there is the world. God has created the world and created the universe in a particular way, and that way, that structure, that energy that God has used to shape the world, we can say emanates out from God, right? That is what touches the world, right? Obviously, God isn't like in a distant place, but it's just an illustration. When God wants something to happen, God, you might say, sends out that energy to nudge the world in a particular direction. In common language, we call that an angel. It's even clearer in English why that is, or sorry, in Hebrew why that is, because in Hebrew the word for an angel is malach, right, which literally means a messenger. And the idea being that an angel doesn't have an independent will. The angel doesn't have an independent existence, so to speak. The angel is an extension of God. It's like if I throw a ball to someone, the ball is not choosing where it goes. The ball doesn't get to pick its destination. It is entirely an extension of me. It doesn't look like it's connected to me, and if you didn't see me throw it, you might think the ball made its own decision, but it is really from me. And so too the angels that we talk about. They are not fluffy. They're not wings, no little halos and all of that. All of those images that were used in either the medieval paintings, again, beautiful art, but not great theology, or that were used by the prophets when they talked about the wings and the faces and the feet and all of that. Those are all metaphors for helping us understand the perfection of angels. And perfect means in this case that they do perfectly God's will. And that is kind of what makes them different than us, right? We have free will, and free will means we get to make mistakes. We shouldn't, but we do. Angels, on the other hand, they don't have free will. They go where they are told. They are just messengers. And that means they are perfect in the sense that they do exactly what God wants them to do. When we say at the end of a Kaddish, for example, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, he is the one that makes peace in his heights, in his heavenly area. Really what we're talking about is the idea that the heavens, the non-physical world, absolutely follows God's will without problem. We, on the other hand, in the physical world, we don't. Now, that interaction between the heavenly world and the real world is taken care of by these channels of God's will, which get called malachim, which get called angels. Now, do we each have a guardian angel? Well, in the movie sense of guardian angel, or in the popular book sense of guardian angel, of having almost like a person that is watching out for you, the fairy godmother version. No, not like that, because we don't need that, because exactly, right? We don't need something in between. Now, does that mean that does that mean there are no angels around us? Of course there are, right? In the sense that God's energy, God's control, God's influence over the world is everywhere. And sometimes that is more obvious than other times, right? Sometimes it's like, whoa, a miracle just happened. And sometimes it's more subtle than that. The light changed red at the right time, or green at the right time, or it rained a little bit more here or a little bit less there. Or the person we were talking to, was that someone at the door?
Yes.
Would you mind checking that?
I'll check.
I can pause myself for a second. Thank you. Oh, no problem.
Go. No problem.
Yep.
Okay.
But we'll carry on, but we can pick up when he comes back in. So angels, right. So sometimes it's just a question of a person saying the right word, right? Why did they say that particular phrase? Why did I happen to bump into them today when they said it? And what did that make me think? And how did that help me adjust the course of my life? Sometimes we don't even notice that these things are happening. And sometimes we are being a malach, we are being a messenger without even knowing that we're doing the job, right? So that influence that God puts into the world around us is similar to the whole guardian angel concept, but without the actual person on your shoulder who is sitting there, watching over you going, look out, there's a meteor, and not so much like that. So yes, there is protection and help. No, it is not perfect and bulletproof shield, and that's not what we would ever expect God to give us anyway, but it's not from an independent contractor. It's from the source itself, from God. Okay. Third question that I had. What are Reconstructionists, or what is Reconstructionism, or Reconstructionist congregations, Reconstructionist Judaism? Yep. So Reconstructionist is the smallest of the major streams of Judaism. So we talked a little bit about Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. Reconstructionist is a movement, and it is smaller than any of those in terms of the number of people. And it has a slightly different perspective on how things should be handled. So you might remember when we talked about the different movements that one of the main things that was different between the different movements is who gets to make decisions about what you should or shouldn't be doing. It's okay. So in the Reform movement, as we discussed, the individual makes that decision, right? If I think that God wants me to keep kosher, I'll keep kosher. If I think God doesn't care if I keep kosher, I won't keep kosher, right? That's the basic principle of Reform Judaism, or one of them. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but for tonight, that should be enough. In the Orthodox world, decisions are made by the highest level of their rabbinic chain. And so whoever is considered to be the greatest rabbi of that group or of that era, they're making decisions that other people have to follow because they can't even imagine disagreeing with that level. The conservative movement says, yes, rabbis make decisions about Jewish law because they've been trained, but that decision is made in a way that understands what the regular people are living, not only people who are like at the yeshiva, at Jewish university level. And those decisions will be different between one congregation and another. So, for example, I may make a decision regarding using musical instruments on Shabbat, and a colleague of mine in Michigan may make a different decision. And that's okay in the conservative movement, as long as the decision is being made according to the regular procedure of Jewish law. Then we're allowed to come to different conclusions, as long as we follow the right process. Reconstructionist Judaism was created by a rabbi known as Mordechai Kaplan. And Rabbi Kaplan was from the conservative movement, but he had a very historical view of Judaism. In fact, he had such a historical view of Judaism as he called Judaism first and foremost not a religion, but a civilization. He said Judaism is a civilization. And as a civilization, yes, there are the learned scholars who keep the wisdom, but there's also the people who live the religion, who live that civilization. Much like in the United States, for example, we have a government, whether it be local, state, or federal, and that government makes laws and makes policy. But if you want to know what's actually happening, you can't just read a law book, right? If you want to know how people drive, you can't just read the Florida law code for drivers. You have to go out and look and see how people are driving. And the culture that people create through their behavior is a mix of the law code and the activity, the real activity of the real people. And so he created this idea that Reconstructionist Judaism was meant to be community-based. So if you want to know what you can and can't do, you have to understand that through your community, not the individual, not the scholars, but through everyone in one pot, but your pot, meaning your congregation. So there are some Reconstructionist communities where everybody keeps kosher. And there are some Reconstructionist communities where nobody keeps kosher. And for Mordechai Kaplan, that's fine, because being part of the community is what defines your community's ideas and your community values. Now, obviously, that's not conservative Judaism, but it is a very interesting way of looking at it. Mordechai Kaplan is also the man who is usually given the credit for creating the JCC movement, the Jewish Community Center. He believed very strongly that there should be community centers that were not just synagogues or not just for Jewish education, but where there was also art and where there was music and there was exercise and theater and all sorts of other activities. Again, because he believed in the whole community idea of Judaism. Judaism wasn't just in religious institutions, it was throughout life. So he had many very interesting and powerful things to say, and I highly recommend reading some of his books. They're not entirely short, but they are very interesting.
His name is
Mordechai Kaplan, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. He lived in the middle of the 20th century. And well, he lived longer than that, but that was his main period of influence. And he really thought this was obvious, that the idea of Reconstructionist Judaism, and he thought the conservative movement would move towards that. And the conservative movement said no. And so that ended up becoming a separate movement called Reconstructionism. So I think there was also a question of, are they considered legitimate? So Reconstructionist Judaism is a different branch of Judaism, much like Reform or Orthodox is. And as a pluralistic rabbi, meaning as somebody who respects that other Jews are going to have different definitions of the ideal version of Judaism that I may not agree with, that I would not live with, but I still respect their right to make those choices. Yes, it is part of mainstream Jewish life. It's not like a Messianic Jewish group. It's not a Jews for Jesus group. It is part of the mainstream Jewish tradition. It just makes decisions that I personally don't agree with and which our congregation and our movement doesn't follow. But again, it's in the same category as Reform or Orthodox Judaism. Good?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, we're doing questions and answers. We're doing questions and answers. Okay, so next question that I got by email, the rebuilding of the temple. Do we do it or not? So as the questioner wrote in, it seems like there are a lot of different opinions. Yes. Welcome to Judaism. On most topics, there are lots of different opinions. But this one in particular has a political element to it, not only a religious element. So the temple in Jerusalem is no longer there. It was last standing there almost 2,000 years ago. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans. The first temple, the one that had been built by Solomon, was destroyed by the Babylonians. Now that spot in Jerusalem is very, very famous. And if you go to Jerusalem, you will see it, trust me, because you're going to look across the Jerusalem Old City skyline and you're going to see a big gold rock, a big gold dome, sorry, that's called the Dome of the Rock. And it's on a big plateau. And that is the area where the temple used to stand. And that's also why the temple isn't there today, because to build the temple, you would have to bulldoze all of the Muslim places of worship on the top of the Temple Mount. Most people consider that to be a politically bad idea because of the horrible violence that would come from doing such a thing. But setting aside the politics, imagining that we were living in a world where there were no Muslims in Jerusalem, there was no Muslim site, it was just a clean slate, right? Just like the Romans left it, just rubble and a flat area. Would we build it then? Most authorities say no, because most authorities believe, from our understanding of the book of Ezekiel and other prophecies in the Tanakh, and based on the interpretation by our sages, that the third temple will be built when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes. And until that happens, until the Messiah shows up, we don't get the bulldozer, right? We don't get the bricks ready. We don't actually start building. Now, there are some people who disagree. There are some people who say we should build it and then the Messiah will come. but they are a minority of traditional Jewish voices. And by traditional Jewish voices, I don't mean just today. I mean, people have talked about rebuilding the temple for the last 2,000 years, since it was destroyed. And on average, most of the authorities for most of that time have said, when Messiah comes, we'll build. Until then, we'll wait. We're good at being patient. Now, again, that has nothing to do with Israel's right to have sovereignty over that territory. Right? Israel, of course, should still hold on to Jerusalem and the Old City in particular. And Israel, of course, should hold on to the land that is necessary for it to be a state. But as far as building goes on that particular spot, most authorities say, hold off. Now, there is more of a disagreement about whether or not, in the meantime, we are allowed to visit the area up there, if we're allowed to go up onto what's called the Temple Mount. But that's actually a pretty evenly divided debate. There are some who say we shouldn't, and there are others who say it's okay to. Personally, I'm in the camp that says it is okay, but that is a very lively debate, and it is not so clear one way or the other what the majority of opinions say. All right, last one from the emails, which is a great question to wrap up from the email version. With no real central authority, the way the Catholics have a pope or Protestants have committees, how are current affairs agreed upon? Homosexuality, Israeli politics, etc. Well, they're not agreed upon. That is to say, there is no Jewish pope. There is no Jewish committee that can force all the congregations that are Jewish to follow that ruling. And there never was, sorry, not never, there hasn't been for 2,000 years. Prior to that, let me just see if that's a technical question. No, I don't think so. Prior to that, yes, there was a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the great court of Jerusalem. And when there were issues that came up that were not already covered by Jewish law, they would debate and discuss and vote and make decisions on how they believe Jewish law should handle that new topic. But since the destruction of Jerusalem and since the loss of the Sanhedrin and our cohesive court system, which did stick around a little bit longer than Jerusalem, but for most of the last 2,000 years, we haven't had such a central authority. We have instead said, you have to make the decisions. Now, not you individually, but you, the Jewish communities, the Jewish sages, the Jewish teachers. And so there is a great deal of agreement. We all agree Shabbat, Friday night, Saturday. We all agree that the Torah is that book that we've got in there, and no one debates what's the content. For example, the Samaritans, they have a slightly different version than we do. But within the Jewish world, we all agree on what the Torah is. When it comes to how to fulfill Jewish law, then you have some people in Europe and some people in the Sephardic world having disagreements. You have some people in Sephardic world disagreeing with people from the Middle East, the Mizrahi. The Yemenites have their own interpretations for some things that are different than the Iraqis, that are different than the Polish, that are different than the British. And that is normal over the course of the last 2,000 years. And we had mutual respect for each other. In the classic code of Jewish law called the Shulchan Aruch, there are actually two authors. The first was a Sephardic rabbi who wrote his interpretation based on his understanding of the three main law codes that came before him. And he literally took majority rules. So if two of them agreed and one disagreed, he went with the two. He didn't say the other one was wrong. He just said, I'm going to try to be universal, so I'll take the majority. And he still ended up following what would be called Sephardic Jewish law. When his book reached Poland, a rabbi there said, this is great, and I agree with almost everything that he says, but there are some things I need to add my own notes to show that in the Polish world and the European world, that's not quite the way we understand it. And so he wrote his own addenda, his own additions to that book. And today, you don't have to buy two books. You buy one book, and they're printed together, right? And one is set off in a slightly different font usually, so that you can tell which one was from Joseph Caro and which one was from Ramah, the two original rabbis. But they are written on the same page to recognize that there are often different opinions. And even within those communities, they often would talk about yesh omrim. There are those who say, meaning that even within the Sephardic world or within the European world, there was still diversity of opinion on quite a few topics. And that's normal and understandable. And the good ideas tended to spread. And the ideas that were not as convincing or as powerful or as helpful for living a good and meaningful Jewish life, they tended to sort of die out. There's a little bit of Darwinianism, survival of the fittest. So some of the ideas from different communities would catch on and they'd spread around, and then people would say, nah, maybe not, and then they'd kind of peter out. And others would catch on and they'd become the new pillar that the next generation would build on. And so that diversity has actually been very healthy for the Jewish people. It allows us to experiment with new ideas, with new interpretations, and different interpretations, and then see in the mix what comes out to be the best idea. But ultimately, in the conservative movement, it comes down to each individual congregation. So we do have what's known as the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which meets in every year and a few times each year to handle big issues. But even that law committee, which makes decisions based on a vote of its committee members, if I think that they got it wrong, I'm allowed to disagree, right? I mean, most people would expect me to have pretty good reasons for disagreeing, but if I just say, you know what, I don't think that they got that right because this, that, and the other, or because I interpret this differently, I still get to be a conservative rabbi, and no one is going to come from New York and kick me out of the congregation. However, the congregation might kick me out of the congregation, meaning if a rabbi starts making decisions that the congregation considers to be, whoa, that's just totally wacko, then the rabbi can be let go, right? The rabbi can be dismissed if they are making decisions that the congregation does not believe best reflect Jewish practice. And that has been true, not just in the modern world, that's been true for, again, a very, very long time, well over 1,000 years, where rabbis serve with absolute authority as long as the congregation accepts what the rabbi is saying. So there's kind of a soft democracy, I like to say it, right? I am the Jewish law dictator as long as you let me. And that has to do with my training, and it has to do with your acceptance of what I am bringing thanks to my training. And if you don't accept me, then I'm not your rabbi. And if I don't do, if I find that you won't accept me, then I would want to move to a new congregation that would accept me. Thankfully, in Temple Israel, we've gotten along really well, so that's not an issue. But hypothetically, this is what happens in synagogues, where the congregation and the rabbi, if they're heading two different ways, then they part company.
But it's always in the conservative, because that's the way it works.
Well, in the Orthodox,
in
most classic Orthodox and in Reform, that's definitely the way it works. There are some Orthodox movements that don't have it that way, that have a more top-down structure. The Hasidic world is like that, where they have dynasties, where they have set up certain patterns and people are appointed and then they are placed and stay. Chabad is most famous for having that particular model, but other Hasidic movements do the same. But by and large, most other Orthodox that are not Hasidic and not strictly held by one lineage of who is the rabbi that makes decisions for everyone, they usually, it is an agreement between congregation and rabbi of whether or not they're going to continue together or move in different directions. All right, so that's it from what was emailed in to me. Do we have questions that are here? You guys have had a little bit of a buffer now to try and think up any additional questions. So fire away. As I mentioned, we're going to be finishing in about 15 minutes because I have to go to the Shiva Minyan.
Simple question. How to run, I'm trying to exercise now.
Good for you.
But Shabbat is forbidden to exercise because it's work, right?
Well, so we're going to get into the Shabbat definitions in a few weeks. Okay. Because when we say, I need like an automatic whiteboard eraser that just, push a button and the whole thing erases. Work, right, does not equal how many calories you burn,
Okay.
right? Work does not equal sweat. Work does not equal how many watts of energy you have. Work does not equal horsepower. As we'll see when we study Shabbat in more detail, work equals the specific legal definition of work that the rabbis understand from the close reading of the Torah. The shorthand way to remember that is that there are 39 categories of work, and we'll go through them when we get to the Shabbat section. And those 39 categories of work are the type of work that was done to build the Mishkan, to build the tabernacle, the tent in the desert during our time after Mount Sinai. So things like cutting and making fire and writing and cooking and grinding and sifting and dyeing and things like that. Dyeing, like color dyeing, not dyeing. Right. Those are the 30 types of categories of work that are forbidden. Exercise does not technically fall under one of those categories. However, there is a concept, which we will explore in more detail, called the spirit of Shabbat, right? The feel of Shabbat. And one of the things we generally try to do is make Shabbat different from a weekday. And so there are things that people will do that, or that they won't do, that they're not prohibited because of the work issue, but if you did it, would you feel that Shabbat was any different than Tuesday? And for many people, exercise is one of those things. That exercise and building up a sweat and doing that kind of work, even if it's just me doing a lap around the neighborhood, is what I would do on a weekday, but not what I would do on Shabbat. There are some opinions, however, that say if you enjoy the run and you don't normally get a chance during the week to run because you're doing business and work and all of that, I mean, like job work, then if it's a pleasurable activity for you on Shabbat, not strenuous, not suffering, not, oh, I don't want to do it, but something that actually brings you happiness, there are some opinions that say, yes, you can go for a run if that is a pleasure for you. Now, going for a horse ride is a little bit different. But
Well, it wasn't like it was the trainer was suggesting that we do it 6 days. But I mean, I can always do it for Sunday.
I was going to say 6 days are perfect. If the trainer says 6 days a week is great.
But he wanted to, like, everybody don't respect Saturday, you know. So he said that's the problem.
That was the day that he said you should run, and Sunday was probably the day he said you get off, right? And this is something that we bump up against a lot living in America. Yes. There is a natural assumption among the vast majority of American people and American institutions that Sunday is special and Saturday isn't. And I can't blame them, because if when I lived in Israel, it was exactly the opposite, right? If I had been Christian while I lived in Israel, it would have totally confused me of like, why does everyone go to work on Sunday and they take off Saturday, right? Don't they realize Sunday's important? It would have felt backwards there too. So I'm very thankful actually that in America we get a 2-day weekend for most people, where Saturday and Sunday are both off, because that at least means that most Jews don't have to worry about their official job on Saturday. Most, I mean, it is not 100% easy to get away from in some types of fields and occupations, but at least you got a chance. At least there's already a feeling that Saturday is weekendish, which kind of gives us a benefit of being able to get away from work on that time. But yeah, this is part of being a minority in the United States.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Yes, I have a few questions too, but how about like me? I've been in the religion for 3 years.
Right.
Seriously.
Yes.
But it's really hard when you live with someone like my mom, and she's Christian,
Right.
and I'm just following Judaism, even though she respects me on everything I'm following.
Right.
But like I would love to make the division in my kitchen,
Right.
Which is meat, dairy,
Right.
like a real kosher kitchen, but she doesn't get it, even though it can be, it's kind of hard.
Of course.
But after
Because
3 years,
it's your path, not hers. Right.
So I just have my own little freezer where I
Right.
keep all my kosher food,
Right.
know? And I have my little section in the regular fridge.
Right.
She has all her stuff, like all of my dairy stuff is in one section.
Very nice. Right.
Everything else, like fruit or vegetables
Right.
could be all together.
Of course, exactly right.
And that's okay.
That is perfect, and a very good compromise. Because one of the things that we often do, I often find when people are studying for conversion, is there are often issues of how will your conversion change your relationship with your non-Jewish family members. And it really depends on each family, but there are a number of different things that I've seen that are common results, right? For some people, they are very, very happy and accepting. It's like, wow, you found a path that means something to you. That's great, because I know you've been looking. I know you never really were comfortable with this other religion or having nothing. And so I'm glad that you found something. Let me know what I can do to help or accommodate and be respectful. And that's great. It's also the minority. You don't get that like for everyone. You have the opposite side as well, which I've also worked with students, where you're becoming a Jew. That is horrible. They are terrible people. They are evil, and it can be just generic secular anti-Semitism, or it can be religious anti-Semitism, or worries about, you're going to be going to hell and all of that kind of thing. And that's extremely painful for people to have to negotiate. And sometimes there really is no solution there, right? Sometimes the family member or even the whole family will be so absolutely convinced that Judaism is evil that there is no way to bridge that gap. And there have been a few cases where that has happened with my working. But there have also been cases where it looked like that was going to happen. And then people realized that their anti-Semitism wasn't worth losing their relative, that their hatred of Jews was something they never really thought about. It was just what everyone says. And when they actually realized, well, wait, my brother's becoming Jewish or my son's becoming Jewish, it forced them to think about it. They were angry at first, and they might have said horrible things, but as they realized my son is attracted to this, they began to approach and say, maybe I've been wrong. Maybe I've been too angry about this. And that's because the large group in the middle, right? Because the hatred and the full acceptance automatically, those are the minorities at each end. Most people in the middle get confusion from their relatives. The relatives don't understand what they're doing. And the main thing that they're worried about, which they often don't say, is, will your change in religion take you away from me? And does your change in religion mean you're rejecting our family, our customs, how you were raised, the values I tried to teach you? And most family members won't say that, but they'll ask questions that are kind of like that. It's like, so does this mean you'll never eat in my house again? Right? When someone says that, they're not asking it because they don't like Judaism. And they're not asking it because they're just curious about Judaism. They're asking that because eating together is a big part of family life, usually. At least it certainly is in my family, and I'm sure in most families. And being able to say, well, I can't have the bacon anymore, but when we get together, I'll bring something, that I know I can eat. And of course, we can still share so many things. And making sure they understand that choosing Judaism is not rejecting them. And that you're not picking Judaism because you're unhappy with them, but you're picking Judaism just because it is spiritually right for you. And when you're living with that person, it can be more complicated.
It's challenging.
Because then you actually have not only the conversation, but you have the practical, how do I do this, and do it in a way that allows us to still share the same space. But it sounds like you're already heading down that right path. So.
Yes, and also I have a brother,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a chef.
Mm-hmm.
And when he comes to visit us, he likes to go out and eat.
Of course.
So, I keep kosher, but sometimes I have to try to bend the rules, because he trying to, when he comes, he likes to go out and us together, like my mom,
of course.
my
He wants to take you out,
and
yeah.
his kids. So when I go out with him, I don't eat any meat at all. I
Right.
eat vegetarian meals.
Yes, and that is a very good default. If you're in a place where you can't get kosher food in the sense of like kosher beef or kosher or even kosher fish, the default position is just fall back on is, I'm going to have the salad. I'm going to have vegetarian.
Yes.
Give me the Brussels sprout. Well, maybe not the Brussels sprouts, depends on how well they clean them, but you go with the vegetarian option.
Yes.
And that is usually a good compromise when you're put into those positions.
Yes, because also, I don't want to. He's my only brother.
Right.
Okay, and this and then he always brings my nephew, my niece.
Mhm.
So I don't want to feel like I'm not rejecting them. I'm just
Exactly.
I'm always going to be the same
Yep.
aunt, and always give them the love and
Yep.
care for them. But because he likes to go out, I say I don't want to tell him no,
Right.
because he wants to be with share a moment, be together, eating outside.
Right.
So I'm always. He understands that. He
Exactly.
knows.
And he does, because from what you're describing is you've done the most important thing, which is you've made it your problem, not their problem, right? Because a lot of people, when they are going through the conversion process or just becoming more observant, and maybe the rest of their family isn't observant of Jewish law, they will make many demands of the rest of the family. I've worked with teenagers that decide they want to keep kosher, and so they give instructions to their parents and say, this is what I need you to buy, this is what we have to do. And it's like, no. Well, because from their point of view, they're doing what's right. And as a rabbi, I have to agree that having a kosher kitchen is the right thing for a Jewish person to do. And so they go to their parents and say, this is how we're going to do it, and this is what Shabbat's going to look like, and it's like, that is the right. If you were living alone, absolutely, you're 100% in control, and that's great. But if you want someone else to cooperate with you, you have to do 80% of the work.
Yes.
Right? So if you want your mom to buy certain things that are all hechshered, because that way you can have, the kosher food, you volunteer to go shopping with her. You don't give her a list and say, this is what I expect. If you want to separate meat and dairy in the kitchen, and you don't own the kitchen because you're a kid, or maybe you're sharing the space, you're the one who has to separate, and you're the one who has to do the washing up, and you're the one who has to make sure that everything is handled right. You don't expect someone else to do it for you. Yeah. And when you make it your problem, not theirs, then they see that you're really trying hard to make it work without making them inconvenienced, without making them feel uncomfortable, without making them feel judged. And that goes a long way towards making things a little bit smoother.
Peacefully.
Yeah. And by the way, that works not only for Jewish thing, but in general relationships. If you have a need, make sure that you remember it's your need, not the other person's need. And you should be doing at least 80% of the work rather than expecting them to do it for you. And of course, communication is also good for any relationship issue, regardless of whether it's religion, work, or anything else.
I have another question, because I work in a regular kitchen.
Right.
Okay. And for some people, they see me like I'm breaking all the time the rules in the kosher field. I'll tell you why. I have to taste the food I do. That's a big, huge issue.
Right.
Big issue I see in myself. And I say, well, God forgive me, but this is my bread and butter job, and I have to taste, but I try not to eat meat.
Right.
I'll tell you, this sounds crazy what I do, but it works for me. I'll tell you what I do. I make a beef stew.
Right.
I don't taste the meat, but I taste the sauce.
The broth, right? The
broth,
liquid,
yes.
right?
If I taste it tastes good,
right.
I know the meat is gonna taste good anyway because that's the sauce.
Right.
So I've been doing this over 2 years now, working in this irregular kitchen, production kitchen, and that's the way I do it.
Right.
So when it's like pork, I'm cooking it. I ask someone, you better taste it and let me know how it tastes, because I don't taste any pork at all and no shellfish.
Right.
I'm allergic to shellfish anyway, but I cook shell, like shrimps or any type of shellfish. And I just, when I put season and everything, I ask someone, can you taste it for me? And they say, good, okay, good. Then.
Right. So ultimately, it would be ultimately it'd be great if you could get people to taste everything for you.
Yes.
Right. But but at least the compromise you're making is moving you in the right direction. And keeping you further from the animals we're not allowed to have anything to do with. Like I said, ultimately, it'd be great if you didn't have to taste the beef stuff either. But it's sometimes very hard to get there. As I mentioned during the kashrut lesson last week, I was raised in a very committed Jewish family, but not a traditionally observant Jewish family. So we ate non-kosher food all the time. That was just normal in my household. And we didn't really, it wasn't a problem. When I was in high school and junior, senior year is when I began to start wanting to keep kosher. But I didn't finish the process of fully kosherizing my life for like another 5 years. You know, so I cut out things like pork at first, and then I cut out shellfish, and then a little later I cut out, you know, things like cheeseburgers, and then I cut out eventually having non-kosher meat at all, and then eventually I actually had, you know, separate dishes and separate pots and pans and all of that. So it took stages for me to be able to get myself to that position.
That's right thing too. Right?
Yeah, and well, that is the way to do it. Looking at the time, we're going to have to stop there. Again,
Okay.
sorry for the abrupt end. Life cycle events sometimes interrupt, but we will continue actually with kashrut on more detail next Thursday night.
There's a lot of neighborhood kids running